Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth part of our three-part retrospective of the Castlevania NES trilogy. Last time we took an unscheduled detour to the Game Boy adventure, The Adventure, and today we will, after 1 year, finish a series originally meant to take 3 weeks. It's as if we're coming full circle with the final piece of the NES trilogy, Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. Every analysis of the NES era notices how a common practice during those days was for a sequel to deviate, sometimes aggressively, from its predecessor. Everyone immediately points out the same 3 games. Sometimes a smart guy will point out Final Fantasy II, and a real boy genius throws in Fire Emblem Gaiden, but I would like to submit to the jury that this trend tells us very little about the era and instead reveals the preoccupations of individual developers. Nintendo, for example, loved stability and functionality. Super Mario Bros. 2 is something of a historical accident, a game born of a desire to have a more playable and marketable game for 1988 North America. The act of plagiarism, or reappropriation, or whatever you want to call the fate of Doki Doki Panic, is markedly different from how Konami treated Castlevania. Konami's love was for excess, sheer, unencumbered excess. Castlevania is a highly stylized platformer compared to its contemporaries. Its aesthetics are gothic, and its controls prioritize lumbering precision over the lightning flash of Super Mario Bros., Zelda 2, and Ninja Gaiden. Simon's Quest breathes this excess, with so many ill-begotten progression markers and gameplay systems, from the crystal puzzles and the day-night system, and stapling the controls of the first game onto a sprawling open world. Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse can be viewed as a return to safety after the Curious Simon's Quest, but I'd say it's just as excessive, just as monumental in its self-indulgence with its Byzantine layering of sprites, and models, and enemies, and levels, and difficulty, and architecture, and stairs, and stairs, and stairs, and magic spells, and transformations, and different playable characters, creating one of the most ferocious experiences on the NES. Dracula's Curse is a game busting at the screws of the cartridge, a game too powerful for the American NES, and one that pushes its native Famicom to the brink. Released less than 1 year before the Super Famicom in Japan, Castlevania 3 is a funerary piece of software, taking everything that the console had to give, until it had nothing left to give. While playing Dracula's Curse, I was impressed at how much it just struggles to run. NES games are famous for sprite flicker and slowdown, but Dracula's Curse exists so frequently in the sprite flicker and slowdown zone that it almost becomes uncanny when it runs at a proper frame rate. And it's a worthy trade-off because the sprites are more detailed and the designs and colors of the world ooze gothic bleakness far beyond what the previous NES games were able to do. For all its great atmosphere, the first was limited by the rudimentary understanding that developers had for the NES in its early years. I praise the first game for how suggestive it is of tone and story, and what Dracula's Curse successfully does is turn a lot of that suggestiveness into explicit formal qualities, such as its branching paths, an open text crawl, and the recruitable characters. However, such expansion to the explicit details doesn't take away from the suggestiveness of the game. When I went back for my second playthrough, I was shocked that the altar Trevor Belmont prays at before beginning his crusade doesn't have a stained glass window. My memory had become so infected by the Baroque exuberance of this game that I had invented details in my mind, details that would probably be there if the system could handle any more. Perhaps this is the old Catholic school education coming back out, but Dracula's Curse is a game that feels not only horrific, like the last 2 NES titles, but sinful. The scope of Dracula's reign is so much more endemic, not just isolated to the castle or the barren lands of Simon's Quest. And with the branching paths, it's impossible to see all the lands terrorized by Dracula. There's just too much corrupted land for even the mightiest Belmont to purify. Of course, Castlevania 3 doesn't isolate its excess to the edges of the screen or to unvisited levels. The more I play this series, the more I question the reputation of Castlevania's difficulty. I fully admit that this is a case of rolling around in the mud for too long, but I have a hard time saying that many of these games are as hard as either their reputation or their contemporaries. Outside of total bullshit games like The Adventure and Haunted Castle, only the first game is hard relative to its contemporaries. I'd maintain that most Castlevania games simply require getting used to, with the occasional difficulty spike. Castlevania 3, however, may just pull up the overall difficulty of the series all by itself. This game is deranged, and it's hard to come up with many other words for it. Medusa heads are introduced in level 1, and should the player choose to go to the clock tower at the first fork in the road, the second level features platforming about as tough as any asked of the player in the first game. Along with the nightmare of navigating gear wheels and pinions, the second level still features Medusas, a real problem for new players just getting used to the game, which they will be with this being level 2. The Medusas pepper the player with damage, constant, grueling tick damage that is uniquely hard to avoid for new players because of how much time Trevor Belmont is forced to spend on the stairs. The stairs in Castlevania 3 are not solely responsible for the game's out-of-pocket difficulty, but they make the game an extraordinary grind. Stairs in Castlevania do make the player invulnerable to knockback, a small concession for how much they limit the player offensively and defensively. You can't jump, and using sub-weapons is more finicky since pressing up on the D-pad moves Trevor on the stairs as opposed to the floor where the up button doesn't do much. It is impossible to walk up a flat floor, but it is possible on stairs, so get used to it. Wiggling Trevor's fat ass sprite up and down the stairs often serves as the best way to dodge damage when climbing the steps of Dracula's castle. Jumping is an underappreciated part of the player's offense throughout all 2D Castlevania, and Dracula's curse proves that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Stairs themselves wouldn't be so bad, but the obstacles in the player's way are often less predictable flying enemies or projectiles, or, my personal favorite, unpredictable flying enemies combined with projectiles. Played in 2023, the stairs are made retroactively more annoying by how you can't jump onto them. You must walk their entire length as a civilized vampire hunter, dapperly marching up from bottom to top. Anyone who's played Bloodstained Curse of the Moon, a game deeply indebted to Dracula's curse, will experience this frustration at the core of their soul. It's not that having to walk the stairs is the worst thing ever, but it slows down the player's pace in a game where every second counts. This game is a doozy, and Trevor's kit is the exact same that his descendant Simon wields in the first game. Because Dracula's curse hasn't completely rotted the land, we do have more tools than Christopher in The Adventure, but having the same tools as the first game to deal with a much harder game is certainly something. In these videos, I like highlighting weird tidbits in the manuals, and here we find one of my favorite quips. The manual calls the cross the Banshee Boomerang, and emphasizes its power by telling us Banshee Fever. Catch it! To say Trevor's kit is the same as Castlevania 1 is a bit of a lead berry, as the player's kit is vastly expanded. As I've alluded to throughout the video, Castlevania 3 adds other playable characters in Grant Dynasty, a thief turned into a demon by Dracula, Sypha Belnades, a witch sent by the church to fight Dracula, and Alucard, Dracula's son, who is disillusioned with his father's evil deeds. All three characters offer unique tools to the player, and importantly are all mutually exclusive. Since the player can only play with Trevor and one other ally, each path through the game offers different challenges, as some sections become easier or some harder. Alucard, for example, can transform into a bat and fly. Sypha has a variety of powerful magic spells, and Grant can climb along walls. The offensive and navigational tools make the game more dynamic, but they also introduce variability into the design. Castlevania 1 is about as close to a perfect game as I've seen, certainly among games more complex than Tetris, but that was in large part through the perfect control the developers had at the reins. With branching paths and variable party compositions, some sections become negligible and others frustrating beyond the likely intention of the developers. The Pendulum Hall, for example, is a non-issue with Alucard, but a borderline Castlevania The Adventure moment with the other characters. Having multiple playable characters isn't exactly a staple in the series, but it is a semi-recurring feature that will later be used more effectively in games like Bloodlines and Rondo of Blood as a more intentional difficulty modifier. Here it's a defining and sexy feature, but the balance issues are still being ironed out. The balance of Castlevania 3's difficulty is contentious, not just because it dives headfirst into psychosis, but also because the Japanese and North American versions of the game are subtly different in small ways that add up. The Japanese version is easier, at least by a few degrees. In that version, Grant's main attack is the dagger subweapon, but in the North American version, he only has a pitiful shank and can only access the dagger throw with the dagger subweapon. And Alucard's heart consumption during his bat transformation is increased in the North American version. Enemies deal fixed damage in the Japanese version, while they deal damage relative to the stage in the North American version. A change that makes the North American early game easier, but the already brutal late game even more stringent. Which, in and of itself, presents problems, but it's escalated further by many enemies and bosses having more health in the North American version. The reason for these changes is well documented, with most being a product of video game rentals being legal in the US, and thus incentivizing developers to pull out every stop to make games just a little bit harder in the US. There are also a lot of other version differences. Many are the product of technical limitations of the NES compared to the Famicom, as well as Nintendo of America censorship policies. I'm not going to go through these changes as I don't want this video to be a shopping list, and there is little to add about many of these changes other than observing that they exist. There's a great page on the Castlevania wiki that documents these changes, and I suppose I could do an audiobook of the page if the demand is high enough. The thing about the difficulty changes, though, is they're like adding thumbtacks to a spiked baseball bat. I suppose it would make getting hit by one more unpleasant, ignoring that a spiked baseball bat would be an effective weapon. But the difference is basically negligible as you die and die and die and die some more. The later levels that have the player ascend and descend and go every which way all over Dracula's castle is the hardest stretch of levels in the series. A small number of people took umbrage with me calling the first Castlevania a really difficult game because it isn't at the absolute pinnacle of NES difficulty, but Castlevania 3 firmly plants its flag along the likes of Mega Man and Ninja Gaiden and Ghosts and Goblins as the hardest games on the console. At least the hardest games you would actually want to play. As with all things, there is an outer limit to difficulty and fun. The limit will vary by player, but I found my pleasure waned as levels like the vertical auto-scrollers 8 HP and ultimately lives under circumstances beyond my crusty reactive limits. Some players will gorge themselves on these late-game challenges and adore the brutality of them. The culmination of this is by far the hardest of the NES Dracula fights. In the first game, bosses were limited to single-phase fights except for Dracula, who balled on you with a second, cheesier phase. Dracula's Curse has multiple bosses with multiple phases, including death, pairing the gauntlet levels with gauntlet fights. It is enormously satisfying to beat these massive bosses, and they are the best part of the game. Sometimes it's a shame that the later levels are the way that they are, but the bosses are the precipice. Dracula himself is such a fun fight that I made a save state right before him on the Anniversary Collection, just so I could fight him over and over and over again until I could beat the fight with no damage. Completing that self-inflicted challenge was somewhat a personal triumph, especially because my memory of this fight from childhood was that angry video game nerd couldn't beat it. Sure, I use save states to practice the fight a bunch of times to set personal bests for damage, and also played on the Japanese version, which has a much more forgiving continue point if you game over during the fight, but still. I was immediately satisfied. Each of these 3 phases of Dracula are fairly challenging, but none of them are overbearing. It's the marathon of the fight that's tough, and to burn away his flesh and bury the whip in Dracula one final time, and see the castle crumble after the darkest night in the series is a great moment of triumph. For some, Castlevania 3 is the height of the series, certainly of its early era, and despite what the game loses with its difficulty, the aesthetic prowess of the game makes up for it. The backgrounds and sprites, and the ripping soundtrack, particularly on the Japanese version, represent not only a pinnacle for Castlevania, but also for an entire console. Ask me to pick what game looks the best on the NES and Famicom, I'm gonna say Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse almost every day. It's with a certain sadness that I close the book on the NES trilogy. Originally, I planned to do a brief retrospective on the NES trilogy, but these videos took longer to make than anticipated. Life has a way of insisting upon itself, and the success of the videos on the other two NES games only added to my attachment with the series. I had diverged to talk about the adventure in my last Castlevania video, so why not? Let's continue the slow journey through Castlevania. Next time, I'll see you for Castlevania 2, Belmont's Revenge.